Maximising residential density, understanding which businesses suit certain areas, knowing where there's going to be massive uplifts in land value due to rezoning, and getting the best possible tenants in through a change of use have massive impacts to your property investment returns. This is a beginner's introduction to town planning in Australia for property developers, commercial property owners, and even if you are a passive property investor. The zoning of a property is the single biggest impact to that property's value, and the scary thing is about 1 in 4 real estate adverts that I see have the wrong advice around town planning. And also the most profitable deals that I've found in real estate is where I've identified a better use based on the town planning than that is currently being advertised. In this video, I'm going to go through the basic terms and concepts of Australian town planning so that you can use this information when considering your next investment. Remembering you can get massive extra returns by knowing the best possible use of the land which you're considering buying. So let's get into it. First things first is what actually is town planning, and the non-textbook definition which I'm going to use is what you can and can't do on the land which you're considering purchasing. Now, most people think when you buy a big block of land nearby other properties that have been subdivided, you will automatically be able to subdivide the land, and this is not the case. Effectively, Australia is one of the most highly regulated markets when it comes to town planning. The whole discipline of town planning is quite complicated. It involves environmental issues, health issues, social issues, engineering, and I want to remind everyone up front that I'm not a town planner. In terms of this video, I'm going to talk about the practical cold face of it when I'm a property investor, property developer, or commercial property owner, and I might get some things wrong because this is only from my experience and I haven't formally studied in this area. Also, every state has different regulations, so if you want more detailed technical information based on a project which you are considering, I would encourage you to speak to a town planner or surveyor which operates in your state so that they can give you this information that's accurate for your particular area. So how does town planning actually directly impact you as a property investor? Well, there's 4 different ways which I'm going to go through. So first thing first is the residential density. For example, if I can put 1 or 2 additional units on a property versus 10 or 20, the extra density has a massive impact on the underlying land value. The other thing is the permitted uses. So for example, if I'm on a busy road and residential is not in favour on a busy road, and I can put, say, a McDonald's or a fast food or a petrol station on it, this might be a better value for that land. The other ones are a little bit more forward looking. So for example, a change in zoning where you're sitting, say, on the urban fringe and you own a rural block of land and that turns into residential, all of a sudden you've had a massive uplift where you could only put 1 maybe property per acre, and now you can put lots of different properties on there. And finally, it's the change of use, which is different to rezoning. So for example, if I'm in an industrial area and there's lots of office demand and I can change the use from industrial to office, that means that there is a lot of tenants willing to take office space in that particular area. And the final zoning impact is those investors that consider subscribing to my channel. So go down there and hit the subscribe button because the zoning permits it. Maximising residential density, understanding which businesses suit certain areas, knowing where there's going to be massive uplifts in land value due to rezoning, and getting the best possible tenants in through a change of use have massive impacts to your property investment returns, and this is all driven through town planning. What is the basic regulatory structure of town planning? Well, effectively, in every state, there is 2 levels of government. You've got your state-based planning and you have your local government-based planning. As a property investor, the first town planning document you want to get your head around is the state-based scheme map or environmental map of the entire metropolitan area, which is not to be confused with the local government scheme maps. Effectively, this is more of a general understanding of where there's residential, where there's commercial, where there's growth corridors, where rural is changing to residential. So you don't need to know this document too well, but having a general understanding of how the city is growing will help you make better property investment decisions. The maps are the easy stuff because the next state-based document which you need to get your head around is the building guidelines or design codes. And effectively, this is a very thick document which discusses all the written regulations around town planning at a state-based level. So this is all the things often around residential development, apartment development, commercial development, and subdivision, and often there's a document for each of those particular areas. So depending on which area you're interested in considering, you need to start reading that document and familiarizing yourself with all the state-based regulations that relate to each respective zoning. Then we move along to local government, and effectively this is where town planning gets a little bit more granular, and there are 3 different types of documents which you need to start familiarizing yourself with. The first one is the scheme map, and similar to the overarching scheme map, effectively this goes into more of a granular sense around density. So rather than just talking about residential, it will then talk about the density which is permitted in each residential pocket, and same with commercial. Rather than talking about generally commercial, it will talk about the different types of commercial uses which are permitted in each different pocket. Then we move on to the scheme text, which is effectively all the written rules and regulations around each respective zoning in that local government area. Finally, there are policies, and policies are often hyper-specific to a particular area or street or a particular type of development, and this helps you have a further understanding of all the council rules and regulations around considering a development in that pocket or that type of property. From this, we then have to understand a concept of hierarchy. So effectively what that means, if one document contradicts another, which one supersedes, and if one document has a gap or forgets to mention something, which document do you take into account? So effectively, policies are number 1. They are the most senior in terms of the hierarchy, but they are the most likely to be varied. So these are the ones that have the most leeway, but they are the most senior. Then we go on to the town planning scheme and town planning map. So this is the local government's town planning scheme and town planning map. Then you have the design regulations or building codes in your particular area and the MRS map. Often when things change at a higher hierarchy, they then get state government to endorse it. So effectively, this should all be considered and it shouldn't contradict. But if it does, that will give you an idea of which document you go to first to get an understanding of which rules you should apply when considering your development. A hot tip for property developers and property investors is when real estate agents advertise a property for sale, they often stop at the local government scheme map. This means that if there's any extra density given in the scheme text or a policy that relates to that particular property, it's often overlooked in the advertising, and this is where you can get some great opportunities where properties have been misadvertised to a lower potential density. With town planning, there are lots of things which will impact the final density that you achieve on a project. But what I wanted to do is, for the sake of this video, simplify it down to the 4 key areas in my experience has the biggest impact on what you can do on a site. And these are effectively the use class or the density, the building height that's permitted, the building size that's permitted, and the parking that's allowed. And finally, if you want to get a density bonus, is to subscribe to my channel, because by subscribing to my channel, the planners will see it and then just let all your development applications breeze through. Guaranteed. It's not guaranteed at all. What is use class? Well, effectively, every single business falls under a definition of a particular use within the town planning scheme. For example, a petrol station will have an entirely different use class to a laundromat. When you look at the town planning scheme, you need to confirm which zones or which areas allow that particular use to be used on that particular land. There is 3 different grades of a use class. For example, permitted means you can effectively move the business in day 1. The next one is you need to obtain planning approval or advertising approval. So effectively, you need to apply to council to confirm that business can go into that particular property, and then you go through the process, and once you've got the approval, you can move in. And finally, the one you need to be most concerned about is being denied that particular use class, because sometimes flat out the council will not allow that particular business to operate on that particular bit of land. With residential zoning in relation to use classes, for developments, you need to confirm the type of development you're considering on the land is permitted. For example, sometimes in some areas it might be residential, but multiple dwellings or apartments won't be permitted, and likewise, you may be required to do apartment development, and single villas or single residential may not be permitted. Moving along to building size, this is often governed by setbacks, plot ratio, gross building area, or site cover, and I'm going to talk you through these components. To setbacks, effectively this is how close you can build to the boundary of a property. It's worth noting that front, side and rear setbacks can all be different, and depending on the height of the building, the setbacks can change. So it's important to work out how close you can build your property to the boundary of the lot. If I'm looking at a site, what I like to do is draw the setbacks onto the site so I can see how much effective area I have for my building. Plot ratio, site cover and gross building area are effectively ratios where you pick some form of the development and divide it by the land area. For example, plot ratio is the amount of internal exclusive use area, so it ignores boundaries and common passageways, but it's the internal exclusive use area of all the dwellings added up, divided by the land. The site cover is effectively the building footprint divided by the amount of land. So they're all metrics to limit the amount of construction on the land itself. The next one is building height, and as the name suggests, it's effectively how high the building can be. It can be done in two ways, effectively the number of stories or a metre figure. If it's a metre figure, you need to work out the average height of each particular floor, say it's 3 metres or 4 metres, and then you divide it by the total metres that are allowed. A planning consideration worth mentioning that relates to the building height is overshadowing, and effectively overshadowing is how much of the shadow of the building casts into the neighbour's property. This is dictated by a range of factors including the design, the setback from the boundary, the height of the building, and also the time of year that the council used to assess it. So I would encourage you to speak to a planner or speak to actually a good building designer that can mock up the overshadowing maps. Finally, parking, and this does trip up a lot of commercial property owners and property developers. Effectively, council will regulate how much parking per dwelling or how much parking per square metre of commercial property, and it's worthwhile going into the scheme and working out each different use, how much parking is required, as well as with residential development working out how much parking is required per residential unit. On bigger projects such as apartment buildings, mixed use and commercial property, what I like to do is a car parking layout. Effectively, what that is taking into account the driveway and access, the car parking bays, as well as the turning circles, so that I know that I can fit the amount of bays which I need on the particular site, because if I don't have enough bays, it might limit the development potential of that particular property or add additional costs such as basements. As we come to the end of this video, what I wanted to do is talk about a few other town planning matters which might impact your development, and the first one is heritage. It's worthwhile noting heritage on a particular site. You might have to retain an entire dwelling, a part of a dwelling, or refurbish the dwelling. So knowing that can add significant costs and limit the development yield. So go out and check your municipal register or heritage inventory in your local council and your state government to confirm that the property that you are looking at does not form any part of a heritage list. Once you've done that, the next thing worth considering from your architect and building designer's perspective is the design amenity. This is not a deal maker or deal breaker, but more and more councils are getting interested in the design amenity of not just the external structure, but the internal living environment for the residents. So things which might get considered under planning includes cross ventilation and natural light. Natural light is effectively the orientation and windows at overlooking of a structure, and cross ventilation is when you open those windows, how much natural air you're getting into the property. In commercial property, Neighbours and Green Star has been around for a while, but with residential buildings, councils are encouraging green development and maybe giving density bonuses for green development. So this is worthwhile considering if you're in the development space. Now, until you have a more detailed understanding of town planning or my next video, best of luck and goodbye.